Welcome to Ghost Pirate Entertainment. I'm your host, Kainan Becker, and today I'm going to give you 10 things you can watch right now on Shudder. Okay, so this list is in no particular order. This is just 10 things that I'm recommending you check out right now on Shudder. So starting out, number 10, I have a movie called Dead Heat. It's kind of a buddy cop 1980s meets horror. It's definitely campy, definitely silly, definitely a horror comedy. But if you really dig 80s horror, I think you'll really like this. The practical effects, there's some super iconic scenes. It has some of the most memorable 1980s practical effects scenes you'll ever see in a 1980s horror movie. It has this scene where they're in the back of this Chinese restaurant and the Chinese food comes to life. Basically, it gets possessed and they have to start fighting these dead fish, etc. Just super bizarre, super silly, but all done practically and just really fascinating on that end and just a good time. So if you want a movie that's more laid back and just kind of a fun thing, you're not wanting something super intense, and I think this is a great one to kick off our list at. So coming in at number 10, Dead Heat. Okay, so my number 9 pick is called Smoke and Mirrors, and it's a deep dive documentary look into the special effects slash stuntman slash actor, I mean, he's done it all, Tom Savini. This movie goes into his beginnings, starting out working with George Romero on Night of the Living Dead, all the way up till today, working on movies like Hatchet. It really goes deep into seeing what makes him tick, as well as just some of the really cool things that he's done, things you might not even realize he's done. Like I thought I knew quite a bit about Tom Savini, but, you know, this really goes deep. It was really cool seeing him talk about Vietnam and how the violence and things that he saw there was really an up-close look at it. And when he came home, it was like he had already done this college course, so to speak, effects to make these, gruesome wounds and all this special effects stuff come to life. And he's gone on to be maybe the most prolific special effects artist in horror movies. So number 9, Smoke and Mirrors. Number 8 is a movie called Maniac Cop. And kind of like Dead Heat, it's the only other one on this list that's that campy, cheesy 80s horror comedy. This one's a little less of a comedy and plays it a little more straight. But it still has that campy, kind of hokey, silly 1980s thing. Like, I love 80s horror, and I had slept on this movie for a long time. I'd seen the name around for years, but had never really watched it until recently. And it's just a fun slasher, with kind of a spin, a little bit of a twist, because there's this crazy, demented cop who's out killing people. But it's just, once again, got a lot of the really cool practical effects, really cool 80s hair, music, vibe. It's just a fun 80s horror movie to check out if you've never seen it. Highly recommend this if you're looking for a good time. I think it would be paired perfect with Dead Heat. So watch Dead Heat and then Maniac Cop. I think that would be amazing. But my number 8 pick, Maniac Cop. So number 7 is a movie that was just recently added to Shudder. It's a Shudder original called Host. There's been a big buzz about this, so you might have already heard about this. But don't sleep on this. This is going to be a movie that everybody's going to be talking about for quite a while. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of making history because it's one of the first, it's the first I've seen, and I know it's the first I've heard of, especially for horror, that's a whole movie done during quarantine. Like, they started this, completed it completely, and it's up on Shudder right now. And they did it all during quarantine, like since the shutdown. The whole thing was recorded using Zoom, which is so fascinating to me because, like a lot of us, we've used Zoom for multiple things. So that gives it this crazy, creepy sense of realism because of that. Basically, a group of friends, they decide, hey, we're stuck in lockdown. How can we do something and get together and do something fun? So they decide to do a Zoom call with a medium. And they basically do a seance over Zoom. And at first, nothing seems to happen, and then this, that, and the other happens, and it turns into a really scary little movie. It's only an hour long, so it's kind of like an episode of Black Mirror or something, but highly recommend it. My number 7 pick, Host. Number 6, I have a documentary called Cursed Films, and It's really interesting. It goes deep into the stories and the myth and legends of some of the most famous quote-unquote cursed films. Like Exorcist, Twilight Zone, The Omen, all these movies that have famous stories of people dying on set or dying shortly around the time the movie was made, or things along those lines, bad accidents, having trouble getting made, all these things where it just really feels like there's a curse. So this is really fascinating into the story and lore of some of your favorite horror movies. Like I said, Poltergeist, Twilight Zone movie, where two little kids and an actor died during the making of the movie. It goes into the history of film and especially into these quote-unquote cursed films, and it's really fascinating, definitely interesting. It's done in hour-long episodes. So number 6, cursed films. And number 5, Exorcist 3. And up until just a few years ago, I never really heard of this movie. I definitely didn't think it was a movie that I needed to check out. And then I saw it. And over the last few years, it's honestly risen up to be one of my most favorite horror movies ever. It's crazy because the first Exorcist is brilliant, legendary movie. But the second one is awful. It's such a flop that so many people never even heard of. Or if they heard of it, they're like, why would I check that out? The second one was awful. Why would I check out the third one? But I'm telling you, this movie, I think I've talked about it on one of their lists before, but this movie is fantastic. It's so well acted. It's terrifying. It has some of the most early iconic jump scares that you might have seen in clips of famous jump scares and whatnot. But it's just such a cool movie. And if you've never seen it, I highly recommend it. Number 5, Exorcist 3. Number 4, I have a movie called Behind the Mask, the story of Leslie Vernon. And it's basically a faux documentary about a fictitious serial killer called Leslie Vernon. And he's kind of like your Jason, Michael Myers type of slasher horror movie killer, right? But the movie is about this film crew who's following him around, making a documentary, and trying to find out what makes these horror monster serial killers tick, right? And so it's very meta and very self-aware, looking at horror and poking fun at it in ways, but it's not silly. It's actually a lot more serious than you're going to expect going in, but it really turns into this fantastic horror movie. Like if you enjoy movies like Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, this movie falls right into that category. Unfortunately, not a lot of people have still heard of this movie, which I don't really understand because it is one of my favorite in that genre of horror movies. Either way, I highly recommend it. It definitely has a sense of humor, but it also is a bona fide, slasher horror movie as well. But it's done really, really well with extremely likable characters in it and some twists and turns. Very fun, very cool movie. So number 4, I have Behind the Mask. So coming in at number 3 is a fantastic documentary. It's The History of Horror by Eli Roth. If you don't know who Eli Roth is, he did the movie Hostel as well as other really famous horror movies. He's known for his gore and just this really twisted, fucked up sense, but he is also an extremely huge fan of the history of horror. And he does this really deep dive docuseries that's 7 parts, I believe, going into all the different types of horror movies. Everything from like supernatural to slasher, etc. And it's so good. It has everybody. It's got the who's who, basically, of people in the horror industry, actor-wise, director-wise, producer-wise, etc. Talking about it, everybody from Robert Englund to you name it. And it's so well done. It's just totally engrossing. And each episode is really well crafted into this hour-long look into whatever that genre of horror is. And it's just a really fun time. And the cool thing about something like this is if you're looking for horror movies and things to check out that you haven't heard of, something like this is great because they'll mention a lot of movies that you might not have heard of. It's where I hear of a lot of the different stuff that I've never heard of before to check out is documentaries along the lines of this one. So number 3, The History of Horror by Eli Roth. Alright, number 2 is without a doubt, the most fun 80s horror movie in my mind. It might be my favorite 80s horror movie. It's definitely my top 5 horror movies of all time. And that is Return of the Living Dead. The only place you can find it right now that I know of is on Shudder. Unless you want to pay for it, which is like $10 to rent, or I don't know, it's like at least $5 to rent. So just that alone, it makes it worth getting Shudder, in my opinion. But I love this movie so much. I just rewatched it, and I don't know how many times I've seen this movie, but I just rewatched it recently, and it's just so fun. The colors, the lighting, the practical effects, Tarman. I mean, that punk rock 80s dancing around in a graveyard, the 80s music, just that it has that really cool 1980s vibe that's just a really cool nostalgic look back into the 80s that I love. As someone who was a kid in the 80s, it's definitely very nostalgic for me. But it's just one of the most fun but also badass horror movies out there, and especially as far as the 1980s go. It is serious, but it's also fun. It has its goofiness, but it also has its legit scares to it. Just a great movie. If you've never seen it, turn this off right now and go watch it. But my number 2 recommendation, Return of the Living Dead. And my number 1 on this list is fantastic. I just finished watching it. It's a little bit long. It's like a little over 4 hours long. But it's this documentary about 1980s horror. And it goes really deep diving into what makes 1980s horror so special. It talks about all the different groundbreaking things that were done during the 1980s. So many great guests like Robert Englund, Kane Hodder, as well as current people that are currently on the cutting edge of horror, like James A. Janice from the Dead Meat podcast and the Kill Count on YouTube. This is just such a fun documentary. I loved it. It's crazy. It's 4 hours long, and I had to watch it in chunks because I couldn't just sit there 4 hours straight. When it was over, I was actually tempted to start it over because I ended up with a list this long of all these different 80s movies that I had never heard of. Because it shows clips, it talks about them, it just makes you want to watch a certain movie just for one special thing that horror movie did that nobody else had done before. Things along those lines. And it's just a really fun watch, especially if you're someone who loves 80s horror. This is a must. But if you're someone who's younger and doesn't know a lot about 80s horror, this might even be more of a must. Because this is a perfect introduction to what makes so many people like myself love 1980s horror movies so much. Alright guys, my number 1 pick, In Search of Darkness, a quest into 1980s horror. Thanks for watching. Please crush that like button and hit the subscribe button. And I will see you guys next time.